In this first of a three-part series of videos, we're going to take a basic look at the appearance and physical properties of a well-known sheet of anti-spin, long pimples, medium pimples and short pimples. In the second video, you'll be able to see high-speed footage of how a ball with different types of spin on,
top, bottom and side spin, reacts when it comes into contact with different parts of a bat.
In the third video, we'll try to draw together some general observations and hopefully raise some talking points so that you'll be in a better position next time you either use or play against these particular types of rubbers.
Appearance. There are many different types of pimpled and to a lesser degree anti-spin rubbers, and each will play and look a little differently. As it's not possible for us to compare them all, we've chosen for these tests some of the most popular versions of each type, with a sponge thickness they're commonly used in. The anti-spin is a very old sheet of butterfly super anti with a sponge thickness of 1.2 mm. For the long pimples, we're using a sheet of Kokutaku Tuple 911 with no sponge attached, sometimes referred to as being OX. The medium pimples are Friendship 563 with a sponge thickness of 1.8 mm, and the short pimples are Friendship 8021 with a sponge thickness of 1.5 mm.
All the sheets are black and none of the pimpled sheets of rubber have been used for more than a couple of hours.
Dome, curl. Out of the pack, none of these rubbers have a factory tune or boosted sponge, and so don't have the curl or dome effect usually associated with inverted performance rubbers. The anti-spin is the most rigid of the four, and the long pimples the most flexible due to it having no sponge. Pimple structure. Pimpled rubbers all have pimples facing outwards, as opposed to inverted rubbers where the pimples point inwards towards a layer of sponge. Usually short pimples will be shorter and wider than medium and long pimples. Medium pimples will typically be longer than short pimples and a little thinner, whilst long pimples will be the longest and thinnest of all. As for how many pimples a manufacturer can include, the ITTF require a minimum of 10 pimples per square centimetre and no more than 30. If you look at the walls of these pimples, you can see that sometimes the walls are wider at the bottom, like a cone. Other times the walls are straight up from top to bottom, like a cylinder. Whether a manufacturer chooses to make the pimples straight cylindrical ones or cone-shaped ones, the widest part of the pimple should always be at its base, so you shouldn't see pimples like this. Pimple pattern. Looking down onto the rubber surface, you can see a consistent criss-cross pattern. The ITTF requires all pimples to be evenly spaced along 3 sets of parallel lines at an angle of 60 degrees to each other. With these rubbers, all 3 have the same pattern. However, when we look at a sheet of Globe 889 short pimples, the parallel lines of pimples seem to be at an angle which is less than 60 degrees. How can this be legal? Well, let's rotate the sheet of pimples around 90 degrees and you can see that the Globe 889 bases its 60 degree angle on the vertical axis, not the horizontal one. By comparison, the anti-spin's pimples face inwards onto the sponge, exposing a smooth inverted surface of rubber to the ball. As you can see, the pimples on the Super Anti are much shorter than any of the pimpled out rubbers looked at here. Tops of the pimples and surface of the anti-spin. ITTF Technical Leaflet T4 requires the surface of the pimple to be parallel to the base of the sheet, and each pimple must be circular in shape. However, the pimple surface can be rough by up to 0.1 mm. A close-up of the short pimple shows lots of dimples on the top of each pimple. The medium pimple also has clearly visible dimples, but because the pimple itself has a smaller diameter, there is less room for them on the top of the pimple and therefore fewer dimples. With these long pimples, you can just see lightly speckled dimples on the top of the pimple. By comparison, the anti-spin surface looks smooth, but when you look closely you can see lots of tiny raised specks on the surface, almost like a coating of grit or a very fine sheet of sandpaper. Grip test.
The ITTF have a minimum friction level of 25 mm. Unlike boosted and tuned rubbers, the policing of this requirement is left to local leagues and relies to a large degree on the honesty of their members. None of the rubbers you see in these video series have been treated in any way, and all are on the authorised ITTF rubber list.
For our simple grip test, I placed a tuning fork on the surface of each type of rubber and pivoted the blade around my finger until the tuning fork slid off the rubber surface. The greater the angle before the tuning fork slides off, the greater the grip. As you can see, there is little difference between the anti-spin and long pimple, and again between the short and medium pimples. However, the short pimples just have the best grip and the anti-spin rubber the worst. Bounce test.
Ideally, all the rubbers will be tested without sponge, But as this isn't possible, we're using them in the most commonly found formats. Now, when you're playing people who play with short pimples, your more aggressive players might prefer a thicker sponge. And also when you're playing people who use long pimples, players who like to chop away from the table might like to have a thin sheet of sponge on. This test is therefore only included to provide a little bit of background when you watch the high-speed footage.
To test how lively the combination of rubber and sponge is compared, I clamped a bat horizontally in the vise and then dropped a ball onto the rubber surface. Although the anti-spin rubber is combined with the sponge, the ball virtually stopped dead on the second bounce. More the type of effect you'd see with the tacky inverted rubber. The bounce was also very low. The bounce of the long pimples was higher than the anti-spin, even though the long pimple had no sponge, and was very similar to that of the short pimpled rubber. The medium pimples, not surprisingly as it has the thickest sponge, bounced the highest, and unlike the others, didn't seem to bounce straight. Conclusions.
As we've already stated, these rubbers tend to come in very many different types, and also different combinations of sponge hardness and sponge thickness. Typically though, the name says it all. Short pimples tend to be shorter and wider than medium pimples. Medium pimples tend to be shorter and wider than long pimples, and long pimples are the thinnest and tallest of them all. Whilst anti-spin looks like normal inverted rubber, the grip will be far less. Next time you play someone who uses these rubbers, why not check the bats before you play them rather than after, when it's too late. In the second of the video series, you'll get to see high-speed footage of how the ball reacts when it comes into contact with each of these types of rubbers at different parts of the bat. And in the third video, we'll try and draw together some general observations about what we've seen. Thank you for watching.